This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. Level 1. The Jewel of Asgard. Long Bayou. Cold held the chamber in its bitter grasp. An intense, unrelenting chill that soaked through skin and muscle and invaded aching bones. Bound in icy darkness, surrounded by stone and shadow, Long Bayou crouched in a corner of his miserable cell and waited. What choice did he have? This place sucked warmth and hope from him, until all he could do was hurt and wait. Sharp footsteps sounded outside his door. The heavy wood flew open. Long Bayou raised an arm to shield his eyes from the overbright candle carried by his visitor. It had been too long since he'd seen the sun. He was weakened by darkness, too drained to even attempt an escape. "Have you changed your mind?" his visitor demanded. The man was tall and arrogant, with high, sharp cheekbones and narrow, dark eyes. He held heavy silken robes off the stone floor in disgust and looked down his long nose at the prisoner. With thin hands, blackened by chemical stains, he raised the candle and peered at his wretched hostage. "Have you?" Impatient, he added. "If not, then you can continue rot down here. I don't care. I'll take what I need without your help. I only offer you the chance to live out of respect for our former friendship." "Respect." His captive smiled regretfully, his words a mere painful whisper. "You show no respect for anyone, not even yourself. Look what you have become. You intend to use me for your own ends. Release me before your treachery is discovered, and you may avoid the wrath of the Emperor. If I die here, the Emperor will have you executed, and you will never join your ancestors with honor." The man laughed softly. "Your threats are empty. The boy Emperor is in Luoyang. He is no obstacle to me, and I don't intend to join my ancestors. I intend to live forever, unlike you, my old friend." The menace in his voice sent a shiver down the spine of his prisoner. Bayou shook his head. When the mantis hunts the locust, he forgets the shrike that is hunting him. His captor sneered. "Don't give me that wiseman rubbish. You forget how long I have known you." When it was obvious Bayou intended to say no more, his captor laughed again and left. In the darkness once more, Bayou pulled in what little remaining strength he possessed and called on the power of the ancestors. He had to escape, yet he could not do it alone. Around him, a faint purple-blue glow began to shine. Picking up a small round pebble from underfoot, he held it in his large hand and blew gently on it twice. In a strange, sing-song voice, he chanted nonsense words over and over above the stone. Slowly, the light around him gathered into a thin, white-purple streak of lighting. It zipped joyfully around his head until he spoke to it sternly. Then it hovered briefly above the stone before spearing straight into it. Bayou whispered, trembling with the effort. The stone split neatly in two in his hand. Each half then twisted and merged back together before pulling apart again. Abruptly, the glow dimmed, and Bayou smiled in weary satisfaction. He raised his hand and blew again, murmuring more words of power. Lifting his hand higher, he drew on everything he had left and whispered, "Seek those that can free me." The glow and the stone vanished with a loud crack. Plunged back into night, Long Bayou collapsed. Chapter 1. Phoenix. Phoenix glanced at his watch and groaned. 5:30 p.m., late. Rising up on the bike pedals, he pushed harder, speeding down the sleepy suburban street. Driveways and front yards flashed past. Neighbors hallooed. He ignored them. If he was late again and Jacob found out, he pedaled harder. His own driveway came up abruptly. He slammed on the brakes, turning to slide expertly into it with a spray of gravel. The adrenaline rush brought a smile of fierce joy to his face. A few more quick pushes brought him up the slight incline and around the back of the mansion he now called home. Well, the house where he lived, anyway. Peering into the garage, he heaved a sigh of relief. His mother wasn't home, and neither was Jacob. Leaning his bike against the house, Phoenix pulled out a key and let himself in through the kitchen door. Pausing for a moment, he listened hard. The big, cold house was echoingly empty. Some of the tension went out of his shoulders. He dropped his Aikido bag on the kitchen floor before slouching over to the fridge to inspect its contents. Since turning 13, 6 months before, he always seemed to be hungry. His mother teased him about it, and, unfortunately, it also gave Jacob another reason to be annoyed with him. After staring vaguely into the full fridge for a while, Phoenix grabbed a container of cold pizza from dinner the night before. He shut the door, then immediately opened it again and picked out a can of Coke. Car tires crunched up the drive. Startled, he stared over his shoulder, as though trying to see through the stone walls. Hearing the distinctive thrum of a big engine, he bolted for the stairs. At the last second, he remembered his Aikido bag and skidded to a stop. A car door slammed, swearing under his breath. Phoenix dashed back and snatched up the bag, shoving the pizza and drink into it as he turned again for the stairs. 7 long jumps brought him safely to the top where he stopped, leaning against a wall around the corner to catch his breath. The kitchen door opened. Heavy footsteps rapped sharply across marble tiles. Phoenix didn't wait any longer. Jacob was home. Stepping softly along the pile-carpeted hallway, Phoenix reached his own room. He eased the door open, let himself in and closed it again, carefully. Only once it was fully closed did he put his bag gently down and finally breathe out. Dropping into the chair in front of his study desk, he opened the drink, sucked up the bubbles, and switched on his computer. Running stiff fingers through an unruly mop of brown hair, he swiveled to stare out the window. Now, if he just kept his head low for an hour or so, his mother would come home, and he could avoid any sort of run-in with his stepfather at all. Jacob would know Phoenix was home by the fact his bike was there, but they had an unspoken agreement to avoid each other whenever humanly possible. Really, the only time they crossed paths was at dinner, and Jacob Smithson never made any sort of song about his stepson in front of Gwen. As he waited for his computer to boot up, Phoenix munched on pizza and thought about his life. There wasn't much to think about. Time passed. Things happened all around him, but he didn't actually feel a part of it. The endless round of school days just didn't seem real. He felt stuck, waiting for something to happen, for some miracle to make it like it used to be when his dad was alive. He snorted, like that was ever going to happen. He had a couple of friends at school, but no best buddies. His dad had always been his best friend, and he just didn't feel like putting in the effort to make another. School itself was mind-numbingly boring, except for sports. He was good at sports, but nowadays he didn't even get to do much of that. Every time he tried to stand up for himself and argue with Jacob over some dumb new rule, his stepfather punished him by cutting back on more of his outside school activities. The only stuff he got to do now was play computer games and go to Aikido. Games were just a time waster, an escape, a place to hide and not have to think. The dojo existed now as the only place he really felt alive. His sensei was pretty much the only person who listened and understood anyway. Phoenix frowned, remembering the reason why he absolutely had to be home on time today. the threat from Jacob to pull him out of classes if he was late home again. He really wasn't sure what he'd do if that happened. Run away. His lips twisted into a scornful smile. Where to? He had nowhere to go. He wasn't old enough to earn a living, and he'd seen what happened to other kids who ended up on the streets, drugs and whatever. Nah. He shook his head and began to check his emails. Jacob might be a prat, but living in the same house with him remained better than the alternatives. Besides, his mother was happy, and that was the most important thing. Phoenix all too clearly remembered hearing her cry herself to sleep every night for months after the car accident 3 years ago. He remembered the helpless anger, remembered how lost he'd felt and how frightened, how much he'd hoped his dad would just walk back in the house and say it had all been a big mistake. He still sometimes hoped that, but he'd learned to live with it now. Honestly, he'd been glad when his mother had finally hooked up with Jacob. She'd stopped crying and started smiling again, at least. Okay, so Jacob wasn't an ideal stepfather, but he was better than some. He was rich, and at least he didn't drink or hit. Sure, he was unfair a lot of the time, like when he grounded Phoenix for stupid little things like running late for school or not putting his plate in the dishwasher. But he was prepared to put up with that for the sake of his mother's happiness. With a sigh, Phoenix turned his attention to the latest online game he'd joined and did his level best to obliterate both restless unhappiness and digital enemies for the next 20 minutes or so. For some reason, it didn't seem to help this time, so he logged out and switched to updating his blog. Nobody read it, but it made him feel better to vent his irritation with Jacob somewhere. Eventually, even the satisfaction of that wore off, and he watched some of the weird stuff that came up on YouTube instead. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Heavy ones. Phoenix glanced quickly at the door. There was only one reason for Jacob to come upstairs: to see his stepson, and that was not good news. Rapidly, he cleaned away the debris of food and tossed the Coke can into the bin. He wasn't supposed to eat in his room. Brushing crumbs off his shirt, Phoenix closed his blog and YouTube and jumped to his feet just as the door handle began to turn. It opened, and Jacob filled the doorway with his bulk. Phoenix tried to resist the urge to back away. His stepfather was intimidating, a fact he knew and used to his advantage both at work and at home. It was hard not to feel young and defenseless when faced with his 6-foot, muscular form. He felt the familiar burn of resentment low in his guts and swallowed hard, pushing the feelings down. Maybe in a few years' time he'd be big enough and tough enough to take Jacob on. But until then... "Did you take the last Coke?" Jacob's gray eyes were narrowed in annoyance. Dumbly, Phoenix nodded, trying to slow his now racing heart. "Sorry." Jacob grunted, his gaze darting around the room. He spotted the pizza container Phoenix had forgotten to hide. His mouth thinned. With 2 long strides, he walked over and picked it up, holding it up in front of Phoenix's face like a weapon. "And my pizza. I was saving it for lunch tomorrow," he growled. Phoenix tried to hold his head up defiantly, but couldn't. He looked away and was ashamed of his own cowardice. "Sorry," he mumbled again. "I didn't know." Abruptly, Jacob moved closer. Phoenix took an involuntary step away and sat down as the chair caught him in the back of the knees. His stepfather leaned over him, placing huge hands on the chair arms. "I'm sick of your attitude, Phoenix," he said, his expression stiff with barely restrained annoyance. "You're lazy and self-centered, and you act as though the world owes you a living. Lord knows I've tried to be patient for your mother's sake. But enough is enough. If you want to continue to live in my house, then you'll live by my rules, understand?" He waited a moment until Phoenix managed a nod. Then he pushed off and stood up. "If not, then you're welcome to go elsewhere." With a glare, Jacob turned on his heel and left, slamming the door forcefully behind him. Phoenix made a rude gesture at the door, then slumped back in the chair, gritting his teeth together to stop himself from yelling an angry comeback as well. It just wasn't fair. It was hard enough to cope with high school, homework, and idiot older kids at school bullying the younger ones without getting it at home as well. If his real dad was alive, this wouldn't be happening. He glanced at a framed photo on his desk. Alex Carter grinned back at him, his arm around a younger Phoenix, both of them smiling madly and holding up a large, silvery trout. That had been such a great camping trip. The three of them had trekked around the Scottish Highlands for 2 weeks, camping and fishing wherever they felt like it. Phoenix grimaced, remembering how his mother had complained about the rain. His father had hugged her, smiled at her, and promised her a week in the south of France, sunshine for their next holiday. Gwen Carter had laughed and shaken her damp head knowingly before sending her 2 boys off to catch dinner. Somehow, when they'd returned, cold and triumphant, she'd had a fire going and hot chocolate ready. That night, the clouds had cleared, and Alex had taken his son and wife to lie in the heather and watch the stars. Shooting stars had arced like fireworks through the brilliant skies. His father had pointed out constellations and told stories of ancient cultures and their beliefs in sky gods. Phoenix had listened, fascinated by his father's gift for weaving stories and fact into vivid images. Eventually, when they were all chilled and tired, he had gone to sleep in their little tent, hearing the laughing, contented, murmured conversation of his parents as they sat by the fire. There was a noise downstairs, the kitchen door closing, his mother's cheerful voice upraised in greeting. Depression descended on Phoenix again like the Scottish clouds. A faint surge of old anger washed through him. He reached up and lay his father's photo face down on the desk. Alex Carter was gone. Things would never be the same again. He was stuck with his life as it was until he was old enough to get the heck out. Slow tears stung his eyes, but he clenched his fists and took deep breaths until the pain subsided. He would not cry. Crying was for kids, and he hadn't been a kid for 3 years now. "Phoenix, I'm home." The lilting sound of his mother's voice rescued him. His mother's light footsteps sounded outside his room. Phoenix hastily pulled out a math book and opened it. In answer to her cautious knock, he told her to come in and swiveled around to face the door, forcing a smile for her benefit. Gwen Carter Smithson peeked around the door, her pretty face worried. "Jacob said you two had another run-in." She came in hesitantly and sat on his bed, laying 2 wrapped parcels down to one side. "Are you okay?" Phoenix gave her a one-shoulder shrug and turned his face away, afraid she'd see the resentment there. "I ate his pizza by accident. He was angry at me. I'll live." "Oh, honey." She put a soft hand on his knee. "He really does try, you know. And you could be a little easier on him if you wanted. I know he's not your dad, but he is doing his best." Hurt that she was siding with Jacob, he swung his chair so her hand slid off his knee. He pulled up his emails again and pretended to read one. Behind him, his mother sighed faintly. "I've got a surprise for you," she offered tentatively, closing his eyes for a second. Phoenix turned back around and tried to look pleased as he took a thick, rectangular package from her hands. "What's this for?" Gwen smiled and shook her smooth blonde head. "Nothing. I just saw this in town and thought you might like it." He shook it a little and looked up at her knowingly. His mother faked a pout. "You've guessed, haven't you? I knew I should have wrapped it differently. You always guess. You're too smart for me." She smiled lovingly. "Go on, open it anyway." Phoenix ripped open the silver paper to reveal a computer game. He managed to work up a little enthusiasm when he realized it was the pre-release of the newest fantasy game, 80 AD. Some kids at school had been raving about it just today. It wasn't due for full release for another 2 days. He'd only be able to footle about on level 1 until the internet servers allowed access to the full version midnight on Sunday night, so this could be fun. Flipping it over, he read the description. The usual quest-type game, set in ancient times with wizards, dragons, gods, heroes, and 5 levels of difficulty. It did come with a set of virtual reality glasses and a body connect receiver, which was extremely cool. It meant he could stand in front of the screen, see the image in surround vision, and the receiver would interpret his body movements realistically, so he could kick and punch the bad guys in the game to his heart's content without having to use a joystick or mouse. The graphics looked pretty good, and there were probably already cheat sites on the web he could look up. Should be interesting for a few hours, anyway. "Thanks, Mum," he said as brightly as he could manage. "It looks great. I'll load it in a minute. What's this?" He fingered the second package, frowning. It was about the size of his palm, but hard and square, like a small box. "Well, if you can't guess, I'm sure not going to tell you." Gwen grinned, her pink cheeks dimpling. "Open it and see. It's something your father gave me before you were born. I've been holding on to it for you. I figured this was a good time to give it to you. You've grown up so fast these last couple of years." She looked at him with a hint of regret. Tearing off the paper, Phoenix wasn't really paying attention to the gift until it fell into the palm of his hand. It was a small box of some dark wood, inlaid with ornate decorations of pearl and some whitish-green stone. The decorations looked kind of like long, thin dragons and birds twisting around the shiny black lid. It was clipped shut with a tarnished silver hook. It looked quite old, but it was probably just some cheap made-in-China replica antique. Still, he raised an eyebrow and glanced up at his mother. She nodded for him to open it. Flicking the clasp open with his thumb, he lifted the lid and drew a deep breath of admiration. Lying on a worn bed of worn red cloth was a necklace, a thin silver chain with a teardrop-shaped pendant hanging off it. Actually, a tadpole shape. The thick, rounded end hung from the chain, and a kind of curved tail pointed sort of down and sideways. It was only about the size of a small coin. The metal had a strange sort of pearly sheen to it, and there was a dot of some other golden metal in the middle of the thicker end. When he turned it in the light, purples and blues and pinks slipped across the surface like oil. It was fascinating, beautiful somehow. Odd and warm to the touch, anger forgotten, Phoenix glanced up at his mother again. She stared down at the pendant with a puzzled expression. Then she shook herself and picked it up from his hand. Briskly, she clasped the chain around his neck and tucked the pendant inside his shirt. Patting his chest, she kissed the top of his head. He could see in the mirror on his wardrobe that she had tears in her eyes. "Your father gave this to me on our second date," she sighed. "I only ever took it off once to get it cleaned, about 2 hours before he died. I remember you wearing it. Where did you get it?" Phoenix pulled it out to look at it again. "We were wandering through an antique store in London, and we found them tucked away in that little box in the corner of an old dresser. I've always liked boxes." "Them." Phoenix looked up at her. "Hang on. Dad wore one too, didn't he? I remember now." His mother nodded, her mouth pulled down at the corners. They were a pair. She traced her finger down the inside curved edge of the amulet. They fit together perfectly. Mine was silvery and his was a gold color, but each has a dot of the other color inside. She touched the tiny dot of gold. It's the Chinese yin-yang symbol, you know, for balance and harmony. It was supposed to bring us happiness in our marriage, although your dad always said, happiness is a journey, not a destination. You know how he always quoted those old Chinese sayings? Phoenix nodded, smiling at the memory of some of his father's more obscure proverbs. He still had no idea what half of them meant. Yeah, I remember his favorite. You often find your destiny in the very place you seek to hide from it. Gwen nodded, then sighed. They did bring us happiness, right up until the time I took it off and he died. Mum? Phoenix protested. You don't really think taking a necklace off had anything to do with the accident? He felt helpless even thinking about it. No, of course not, she reassured him. It was just an unlucky coincidence. Gwen shook herself and stood up. Unfortunately, on the day your dad died, his half disappeared. The paramedics thought the chain must have broken in the car accident and either someone picked it up or it got swept up by the street cleaners. She frowned. I've always wondered if it was those two odd people that were seen with your dad just before he died. She shook her head and sighed again. Phoenix shifted on his seat, not knowing what to say. Anyway, with a bright smile, she leaned down to kiss him again. Happy Anything Day. Thanks, Mum. He held up the amulet. This is the best gift ever. I promise I'll take care of it. She smiled sadly and nodded. I know you will. You're a good key, young man. Kissing him again, she moved toward the door. I'll go so you can play your game. Do come down in time for dinner, though. Chef's making your favorite. Okay. Phoenix watched the door close, then stared down again at the half-amulet around his neck. It was warm. Maybe that was just because it was against his skin. Or maybe, he thought secretly, it felt that way because his father was somehow still connected to it, watching over him. The sound of his stepfather's voice downstairs made Phoenix shake his head irritably. How stupid. There was nobody watching over him. His father was dead, his mother married to an idiot, his life reduced to escaping into computer games whenever he could. Destiny. Ha! Some destiny. With a twist to his mouth, Phoenix stuck the new game into his computer and started to read the instructions. Chapter 2. Jade. Amber, Crystal, Jewel, have you seen Jade? A shrill voice from the kitchen made Jade shrink further into the darkness. She bit her lip, staring hopefully at the bottom of the stairs close overhead. She hadn't tried this hiding place before. Maybe they wouldn't find her. Jade, Jade, Mom wants you. At the sound of 3 girlish voices and 6 feet thumping up the stairs, Jade gritted her teeth. If only she could find somewhere to be alone. Jade Pearl Lockyer, get your backside out here this minute. She sighed and pushed open the tiny storage cupboard door with her foot. There was no point in hiding when her mother took that tone. She really should have been helping out for the party anyway. Besides, it was a waste of a good hiding place. No one else knew about this secret small cupboard under the stairs, and it even had a light in it. She'd managed to stash a few books and some food in there earlier. Maybe she could sneak back and get away from her noisy, irritating family for a while later on. I'm here, Mum, she yelled, closing the almost invisible door behind her and brushing dust off her clothes. Stomping into the kitchen, she blinked at the chaos there and barely protested when her mother dumped a huge bag of potatoes into her hands. Good. About time. Peel these and wash them. There's only 2 hours until the party, and I have to make potato salad to take with us. Her mother turned back to direct one of the other girls to cutting up celery. Jade wrestled a stool away from Amber. She sat down at the big kitchen bench, ignoring her older sister's childish protests. Glowering, Jade snatched up a potato peeler and began peeling. Annoyance faded a little when she realized she hadn't washed her hands. Ha! Maybe everyone at Coral's party would get botulism. lost in a pleasant daydream where she somehow managed to save everyone at the engagement party from the horrors of food poisoning. Jade worked steadily through half the bag without noticing. Oh! A screeching howl of pain snatched her back to reality. Ruby was clutching her hand and yowling in agony, while her mother and the other girls twittered around like helpless butterflies. Jade saw the angry red burn on her sister's hand, where she'd tipped hot water on herself. Without hesitation, she put down the half-peeled potato, picked up a knife and ran out the back door. Slicing off a thick leaf of a plant by the door, she raced back. Deftly, she slipped the knife along the length of the leaf, exposing a gooey jelly inside. Jade wormed her way through the throng of chattering girls and grabbed the burned hand. Before Ruby could protest, Jade slathered the yellowish jelly over the burn. Ruby sighed in relief. With a smile of pride, Jade turned to her watching family. Her mother blinked in astonishment. "What is that disgusting stuff?" she demanded. Jade's heart sank and she looked around to find all 6 of her older sisters and her mother staring at her like a bunch of clones, all with the same expression of wary distaste on their pretty faces. "It's aloe vera, perfect for burns. I planted some about 2 months ago right by the back door just in case of an emergency. Like this." She tried hard not to let worry creep into her voice. She had done the right thing. Why couldn't her mother see that? Jade stared at her toes as her mother rolled her eyes in disgust. No matter how hard she tried, nothing she did was good enough. All her older sisters were prettier than she. All blonde, curvy and blue-eyed, all with boyfriends, friends, and full social calendars. The whole family looked on their youngest sibling as some sort of freak. Jade had short, wavy dark hair and green eyes. At almost 14, she was thin and wiry. All her sisters had already been young women at the same age. Sometimes she thought she must be adopted. But who in their right mind would adopt a 7th girl? "Everything all right in here, Allison, ladies?" A mild voice inquired from the kitchen door. Jade looked up to see her father standing there and knew she wasn't adopted. All her sisters were younger versions of her mother. She was the spitting image of her father. She glanced up at him, looking for support, while her mother replied in a cross tone. "It's only Jade showing off again, Hector. Honestly, you shouldn't encourage her." She huffed and turned back to settle Ruby on a chair in the corner. "Get back to work, girls. Coral, you get up to your room and get changed. Hurry." Glancing at her watch, she cast a despairing look around the chaotic kitchen. Her eye fell on the half-peeled potatoes and she groaned. "Jade, that stuff had better not stain your shirt. Quit fussing with your stupid herbs and get back to the potatoes. We all have to be in the car in an hour and a half." Jade caught her father's ironic gaze and tried to hide the hurt she felt at her mother's dismissal. He smiled slightly and nodded at the aloe leaf still in her hand. With that tiny smile, he acknowledged her quick thinking before retreating back to his study. She relaxed. Dad understood. He had seen and approved. She resumed her work, feeling almost content. She could hardly wait to get this party over with, so she could help him in the glass house with the latest exotic specimen he'd brought back from South America. Spending time helping Dad prepare and study plants for his botany students at Cambridge was way more rewarding than peeling potatoes. Dad never criticized her. If only he didn't have to go away so much. Home was no fun at all when he was gone. Maybe she could just stow away on his next trip and be his assistant. That nice little daydream ended abruptly when her mother caught sight of the still unpeeled potatoes. "Jade, concentrate on what you're doing. Finish those potatoes." She sighed, hunching her shoulders. She knew she'd never be able to live up to her mother's expectations. Why was it so awful that she liked to read or mess about with plants instead of buy dresses and try on makeup? Jade finished peeling the potatoes and glanced around. Everyone was frantically and no one was watching. She stole out of the kitchen and made for the cupboard again. Maybe if she was very, very quiet, no one would notice and they would all bustle off to the party without her. Just the thought of having the whole entire house to herself made Jade hug herself in delight. No sisters to tease her and steal her books. No mother to shake her head in despair. It was a small house, old and full of secrets. They'd only lived here a year, and so far she'd discovered an attic full of discarded bits of other people's lives. A secret drawer in the fireplace mantel, regrettably empty. And now this secret cupboard under the stairs. Her retreats to the attic hadn't lasted long, but they'd been full of imaginary adventure. Who had slept in the tiny broken cot? Whose favorite toy had been the wooden doll with painted eyes? A wooden sword had given her hours of enjoyment, battling ancient dragons and knights. Then her sisters had discovered her, and the magic had been lost in their exclamations of disgust. It was so dusty and gross up there. "Ew," they'd said. Their mother came up and stripped the place bare. What was saleable was auctioned on eBay. What wasn't went to the dump. The doll, the cot, gone. Jade managed to hide the sword in the back of her closet, but now there was nowhere to play with it. The attic was converted into a retreat for the older girls, and Jade banned from it until she turned 16. So the cupboard under the stairs was all that remained secret. Jade smiled a little as she crept into it. She felt like Harry Potter, but she was hiding out by choice. Oh, how she longed to be like Harry and disappear off to a magical school of wizardry. Did being the seventh daughter of a seventh son make her magic? Or maybe to some place where she could train to be a knight? Maybe not. That armor looked pretty heavy. She picked up the book she'd been reading. It was the sudden silence that roused her from a world of fantasy. Listening, she cocked her head. The house was silent. Worried, she pushed open the cupboard door and darted out. "Mum, Dad," her voice echoed around the house. There was no reply, no footsteps, no noise at all. They really had left without her. Her first reaction was one of delight. No stupid, boring engagement party. No being good for hours on end in company. No having to listen to dumb speeches about Coral and her fiancé. No having to fetch and carry and play waitress. And, especially, no princessy, perfect sisters swanning about making her feel ugly and clumsy. She had the whole house to herself. Yahoo! Executing a neat dance step, Jade shimmied down the hall, singing the theme song to a weekend cartoon. I'm strange, and I like it. That's just the way I am. In quick succession, she peeked into each room of the bottom floor just to make certain she was completely alone. She was. Everyone was gone. The big old house was totally empty. Completely, totally empty, except for her. In fact, it was very empty, maybe too empty. Jade stood still in the middle of the entrance hallway, listening. The wind picked up a little outside. That must be what caused that strange wooing sound she could hear. Yes, she reassured herself. It was just the wind going past the chimney stack. That rattling, well, that had to be a window one of the girls had left open upstairs. Honestly, she fumed, how thoughtless they were. She turned and placed a foot on the bottom stair, ready to go up and latch the window. Darkness cloaked the top landing. All the lights were turned off. It's just darkness, she admonished herself firmly. She took another step upward, trying to ignore the sudden flutter of her heart. Somewhere up there, a floorboard creaked. Then another. Swallowing, Jade backed down again into a corner of the hall, where she huddled with arms around her thin body. These were not the noises she was used to hearing in this house. She was so used to the sounds of her 6 sisters chattering and fighting that it was unnatural not to hear them. It didn't make her feel better to tell herself that all old houses made creaking noises. The wind outside was now fairly howling, and rain pelted against the timber walls. The window rattled again. A shrill jangling right beside her made her leap a foot into the air and let out a shriek. The telephone. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the ancient handset, and then paused. Should she answer it or not? Images of horror movies jumped into her head. People left home alone and stalked by axe murderers. What if it was her parents calling because they realized they'd left her? What if it wasn't? Her hand hovered over the handset for 5 full rings before she snatched it up. Hello, she stammered. Are you all right, honey? Her dad's worried tones sounded hollow and far away. A rushing noise in the background almost drowned him out. Dad. Jade let out the breath she'd been holding and sat down on the telephone stool in relief. The house suddenly seemed almost ordinary again. I'm fine. You guys left without me, she complained, forgetting that it was her own wish. Granted. Sorry, honey. Your mum was in such a hurry we didn't count heads. Are you coming back for me? Jade heard giggling. She realized her sisters had known she was missing and had deliberately not told their parents. Biting her lip, she struggled not to cry. They were so mean. We really can't. We're already going to be late for Coral's engagement party as it is. He sounded regretful. Jade heard her mother's voice clearly, complaining about her youngest daughter's complete lack of consideration for others. Her father hushed her mother loudly, and Jade choked back tears of hurt. She felt guilty about causing so much trouble, but it really hadn't been on purpose. Surely her father knew that. Dad? She sniffed. I didn't do it on purpose. It's okay, honey, he reassured her. I've called Mrs. Nevin and she's going to come over to babysit until we get home. She won't be there for about an hour, though. Can you manage? She nodded, forgetting he couldn't see her. Sure, Dad, she said morosely. I'll be fine. I don't really need a sitter. Even as she said it, Jade realized that she was quite glad Mrs. Nevin was coming over. She'd never let her sisters know that. I know, but I'd feel better if you had someone with you, he replied. We'll be pretty late getting home. She could hear the pride and worry making his voice smile. She gave in. Okay, but... Yes. Can I play that new computer game you got yesterday? She begged. Dad never ever let anyone play on his computer. It was the only computer they owned, and he didn't want to risk it getting broken. Please. He chuckled. All right, but you know the deal. I know. She giggled, happier now. Don't let the others know. As if they'd want to play computer games anyway, Dad. Don't be cheeky or I'll change my mind. He spoke sternly, but she heard the smile in his voice again. Be good. Call us if you get scared before Mrs. Nevin gets there. I'll be fine, Dad, Jade said more confidently than she felt. I'm almost 14, remember? How could I forget? Bye, honey. Bye, Dad. Thanks. She hung up the phone and bounced up, excited all over again. She clapped her hands and raced toward her father's study without looking up the dark stairs. Her sisters could keep their stupid party. She was going to create the most beautiful kick-ass avatar in history, play 80 AD, and defeat the evil villain, Feng Zhudai. Jade was almost there when she spotted the door to the understairs cupboard. Golden light streamed out the half-open door for all the girls to see when they came home. That wouldn't do at all. Hurrying back, she reached around and felt for the light switch. Instead of the switch, her fingers encountered something soft tucked into a corner of the wooden beams that lined the tiny room. Ducking her head in, she tried to see what it was, but her head blocked the light. She had to wiggle it out of its hiding place by feel alone. There was only a tiny piece sticking out, so it took a bit of work to get it all free. Finally, she held it in her hand, a small green velvet bag, the sort a jeweler might put a trinket into at the craft markets. It couldn't be very old, because the bag was in perfect condition. The pull-tie strings at the neck were even finished with little plastic bits like shoestrings. Still, Jade felt a quiver of anticipation in her belly as she tugged at the neck of the bag. Who had hidden it? What was in it? Why was it so carefully secreted away? Was it dangerous? Magical, maybe? Taking a deep breath, she got a firm grip on her imagination. Her father always laughed at her wild stories. The bag slid open and she tipped it onto the palm of her hand. Out slithered a fine gold necklace with a pendant on it. Touching it with a gentle finger, she drew a slow, reverent breath. The shape looked familiar somehow. It was a kind of bent gold teardrop shape with a pearl dot on one end. The delicate chain threaded through a tiny loop in the skinny end of the drop. It was beautiful, and she realized sort of warm to touch. Inspecting the chain, she discovered the clasp was broken and it was marked with smudges of a dark, rusty-colored stuff that flaked off on her fingers. Jade touched the chain that hung around her own neck. Her father had given her for her 10th birthday. It wasn't nearly as pretty as the one in her hand, but at least it was whole and clean. Quickly, before she changed her mind, she slipped the pendant off its chain and onto her own. She glanced at it once more before tucking it safely inside her t-shirt. There was now a small, warm spot on her chest where the pendant lay. Guiltily, she glanced around. She sort of expected the real owner to show up and demand her property any moment. That was silly. The previous owners were a very old couple who lived in the house for 20 years or more. They didn't have any children or even any grandchildren whose nimble fingers might have hidden the necklace away. It certainly was a puzzle. Who could have put it there? One of her sisters? She hoped not. She didn't want to have to share her hiding place or this secret treasure. Jade chewed her bottom lip, then tucked the broken chain and bag into her pocket. She really didn't want to give the pendant back, but she didn't like feeling guilty about keeping it. She switched off the light and slid the door shut. Tomorrow she'd show it to her father and he could tell her what to do. Yes, that was the right thing. Feeling better, Jade went to her father's study, via the refrigerator for a snack. Chapter 3. Let the game begin. Right. Character selection. Phoenix put the VR headset aside for the moment and scrolled the mouse pointer down the screen, scanning the list of character types with idle interest. If he was going to play, he wanted to be something strong, something invincible. There, the warrior. Yes, choosing carefully, he equipped his hero with a short sword, iron-studded leather armor, a shield, and a dagger. Pausing, he thought about what an adventurer would need to survive in the old days. This game seemed a lot more complex than he'd thought. It wasn't just your simple quest with lots of fighting. In those, all you had to do was kill things. This was an online, role-playing game where you had hundreds of choices and decisions to make about everything, and each choice affected how the game went. Of course, you still got to kill things. He had to plan for long trips and bad weather, for hunger and thirst, for hunting and sleeping outdoors. It was pretty cool, actually, but it did his head in trying to think of what someone living off the land 2,000 years ago might need. He added a water skin, a coil of thin rope, boots, shirts and breeches, a thick traveling cloak, flint and tinderbox, and a small sling for hunting. There didn't seem to be an option for underwear. Maybe warriors didn't wear underwear. He grinned at the thought, his earlier depression slipping away as he got involved in the game setup. He needed a name. He couldn't keep thinking of him as hero or warrior. With a wry grin, Phoenix typed his own name in the field. The Phoenix. It sounded more like a modern superhero, so he deleted the "they" and left just his own name. Now at least he could pretend his life was different. Okay. Other characteristics. There were random dice roll buttons to choose for things like intelligence, charisma, health, strength, dexterity, and looks. The result could be anything from 2 to 20. A 2 meant you were really stupid, while a 20 meant you were a genius. You could roll the dice only 3 times for each attribute. If you didn't like the third attempt, it was just too bad. Phoenix pushed the roll button for intelligence. A 15. Quickly, he hit save. 15 out of 20 was pretty good, especially for a warrior. Next was charisma. He switched out of the game for a moment and looked the word charisma up in the online dictionary. It said, those special qualities that give someone the ability to influence or impress others. From the ancient Greek word charis, meaning grace. So it was kind of like charm or interestingness, if there was such a word. Well, surely it wouldn't be so bad if that were a bit low. It wasn't as though a warrior spent much time chatting and impressing the person he was fighting. He stuck with the 14 that came up second roll. His health and looks came out as average, which was fine. After that, he had to resort to the dictionary again to find out what dexterity was. It meant how quick and skillful his character was on his feet or with his hands. He was a bit disappointed to only get a 14 for that, after 3 tries. It meant his warrior would be just average, and that wasn't great for a swordsman. Maybe he could get better. The rules said as you went up levels, you could improve some of your attributes. For strength, he rolled 20 the first time, saving it with a fierce grin of triumph and an unexpected surge of relief. He would kick butt. Finally, he saved the character and quit the game temporarily. It was time to hunt up some cheat sites on the net. Okay, so it was a bit wrong to cheat, but it was only a computer game. What harm was there? Phoenix realized he was arguing with himself and shook his head. It was like hearing his father's voice in his head, urging him to always do the right thing, not the easy thing. Had his father even known that sometimes doing the right thing got you nowhere? Probably not, he thought with easy teenage scorn. He'd never had to deal with someone like Jacob. Jacob didn't do the right thing, so why should he? Stubbornly, Phoenix began searching for the cheat sites. Unfortunately, being still in pre-release, there wasn't much out there yet, but he tagged a few sites that had some useful hints before re-entering the demo version. After a deep breath, he pushed his chair out of the way, stood up and put on the VR headset. It was a full-face unit, so as soon as it was on, he could see the 80AD world in all directions like he was really in it. He turned around, and the view changed, showing him what was behind his avatar. Cool. The image of grass, forest, a dirt road and forest, was so vivid he had to raise the mask for a moment, just to be sure he was still in his room. Amazing. The graphics were brilliant. Still a little on the too smooth side, as with all digital stuff, but better than most others on the market. The earphones built into the headset even gave out sounds. Birds twittering, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the wind in the trees. Phoenix raised his right hand so that his avatar's hand appeared in front of his face. He held a sword. He grinned, swishing it around experimentally. This was almost as good as actually being there. With this, he could really imagine he was in 80 AD. In fact, it took no imagination at all. Totally freaking awesome. For a long moment, he stared around and let himself imagine he really were there, in another world, living another life, being the all-conquering hero. It was a thrilling idea. He really wished it were true. Wished he could actually somehow transport himself inside the game and really be Phoenix the kick-ass warrior hero for a while. With a sigh, he shook his head, hit the begin button and waited to see what would happen. He lost himself in the game. He missed dinner. Against the standing rule about eating in his room, his mother eventually brought up a cold plate of food and a piece of cake. He barely heard her quiet, "Dinner, honey," and didn't hear her leave his room. He was kicking butt big time. He couldn't wait for the full release so he could work through all Bible levels. It promised to be even better. He spent a while wandering about the woods beating up bandits in a very satisfying way before running into a two-man Roman patrol. A short, nasty fight left one soldier dead, and Phoenix's avatar with a deep wound on his left arm. The other soldier ran away. Phoenix figured it was more important to get his arm fixed than chase him, so he tore a strip from his shirt to tie around the wound, then headed toward a small village. He'd worked up a sweat anyway, so he sat down for a while and ran the game in normal mode. Character notes on the heads-up display of the VR set told him his hero was thirsty and hungry as well. It took a while, but he finally worked out that a round, thatch-roofed mud house with a bit of dried plant hanging off a signpost had to be the local tavern. What a sight it was inside. He'd been expecting a pub like the one in town, with tiled floors, a long polished bar, and a big screen television. Lots of clean glasses and bottles lined up in fridges. Of course, this was England of 2,000 years before, although it was called Albion back then, not England. The game rules said Level 1 was set in pre-Christian, Iron Age Britain of 80 AD. That put it shortly after the Roman invasion. Agricola, the Roman governor of Britain, was busy squashing the local Celtic tribes in short, brutal battles. It was a dark, unsettled period in British history to which the game programmers had added fantasy elements: elves, dwarves, trolls, dragons, and the like. So there were no bars or fridges, no electricity or cars, no filtered water or soft drinks. Instead, the tavern was dark and smoky with a few rough benches and tables set around a central fire. Stray bits of straw drifted down from the thatched roof, adding to the general filth of the packed earth floor. Cups and plates of clumsy clay rested on heavy tables of unfinished wood. Some sort of thin ale was being poured from big barrels by a suspicious-eyed tavern keeper. Phoenix got his warrior to drink it, half wishing he could really taste it. It was probably pretty disgusting, though. Through the headset, he could even hear the coarse laughter of the customers and the barks of dogs that roamed freely over the floor. It was fairly impressive. The graphics really were superb. He decided to stay and eat, too. The tavern keeper served him a watery soup. Phoenix didn't want to know what the floaty bits were. He glanced at his own real dinner and nibbled gratefully at a slice of roast beef. Finally, he noticed blood seeping through the bandage on his digital arm and decided he'd better find a doctor. As he headed for the door, the tavern keeper yelled at him, demanding payment for the ale and food. It was only then that Phoenix realized what he'd forgotten. Money. His warrior had none at all. He stared blankly at the screen, wondering what to do next. The tavern keeper took grudging pity on him and said that if he'd chop wood, he could pay off the debt. Phoenix thought seriously about telling him to go jump in a lake. Couldn't he see the warrior was wounded? What right did he have to make him work like some sort of slave just to pay for a drink? Just as he opened his mouth to give a nasty answer, another person entered the tavern. All the talking stopped, and every CGI man in the room turned to look at the stranger. It was a girl, and not just an ordinary tavern wench either, whatever they looked like. This girl was the most beautiful thing Phoenix had ever seen. Even with the slightly unreal look of computer graphics, she was still extraordinary. He couldn't help but stare. She wore a rough-woven brown, hooded cloak that didn't completely hide her slanted green eyes and long, fair hair. As he looked closely, he realized she must be another player. All of the players had a small P embroidered somewhere on their clothes, just to help others identify them. Hers showed on the left shoulder of her dark green tunic. His was embossed on the leather of his character's armor. He grinned a little when the tavern keeper abandoned him and bustled up to the girl, demanding to know what she wanted. Women weren't allowed in the taverns. She asked for food, jingling a full belt pouch to show she could pay for it. Silence fell again as the villagers eyed her now, with a different kind of greed. Even the kitchen boy, who had served Phoenix his food, stopped in mid-stride to stare hungrily at her. She seemed startled and glanced around. Phoenix felt for a second that she'd looked right at him, straight out of the computer screen, and actually at him. He shivered and noticed how warm the amulet on his chest was. It seemed to be getting warmer, too. Distracted, he fingered it. The tavern keeper refused to serve her and turned away. Looking lost, the girl headed back toward the front door, only to be stopped by three large peasant types led by a smaller man. He was thin, with a pointed weasel face and shrewd, dark eyes. "There's a toll for the likes of you, wench," he sneered. She backed away, holding her hands up in a peaceful gesture. In one, she carried a quarterstaff. "I just came in to get food and shelter from the storm," she assured him. "I don't want any trouble." Phoenix almost laughed. Why was she playing this sort of game if she didn't want trouble? This would be interesting. He leaned against a post, watching. The peasants closed in on her. Other patrons sensed what was coming and hastily got out of the way, tossing down their drinks and sliding out of the room in a hurry. The innkeeper groaned and began packing away breakables as fast as he could. Phoenix grinned widely. A bar fight. Now this was more like it. As her four attackers spread out to encircle her, the girl turned, trying to keep them all in sight. She changed her grip on the quarterstaff, holding it crossways in front of her body. For a few tense moments, action was suspended as everyone froze to assess their best options. One of the men launched himself toward her. She reacted in a blur of movement. Thump! The end of her staff punched out, catching him directly in the solar plexus. He flew backward to slide bonelessly down a wall, gasping for breath that would not come. It had happened so fast that the other three were still moving toward her. Now she stepped into the gap she'd created and could see all three of them at once. Phoenix nodded approvingly. She might just make it after all. He straightened up, frowning. The smallest man wasn't playing fair. He slid around and was trying to come at her from behind by crawling under one of the bench tables. He had a dagger in his hand and clearly intended to stab her in the back. Thwack! Another foe dropped at her feet, felled by a perfect blow to the head. Phoenix almost applauded out loud. Instead, he called out a warning to her. "Behind you!" She spun, twirling the staff gracefully in an arc over her head. It came down across the weasel-faced man's outstretched hand. Bones broke with an audible crunch. The would-be murderer whimpered, clutching at his arm as he backed away. Casting Phoenix a venomous glare, he jerked his head at his remaining crony, and the two edged away. Keeping the girl in sight, they finally retreated out the front door. It slammed shut behind them, leaving the bar empty except for her, Phoenix, and the kitchen boy, who had observed everything with a gap-toothed smile of appreciation. Clapping, Phoenix hitched himself off the pole and sauntered over. She looked at him warily. "Nicely done," he complimented her. She grimaced at the two prone bodies. The tavern keeper reappeared and began the task of tidying up, muttering to himself and sending them irritated looks. Phoenix stuck out a hand. "I'm Phoenix." He pointed to the P embossed on his armor, so she'd know he was a player, too. She relaxed and smiled slightly, shaking his hand. "Jade, thanks for the warning, by the way. You're welcome. Oh, leave it be, would you?" This last comment he addressed to the innkeeper, who had returned and was now complaining loudly about damage, non-payment of bills, and women in the bar. "She's with me, okay?" The tavern keeper sent him a scathing look and jerked his head. "Well, if she can pay for your bill of fare and the damage, she can eat too. Out back, though," he said roughly. "There's a storm coming," she protested. "I need—" She glanced at Phoenix and changed her sentence. "We need shelter. Thus welcome to the barn out back for an extra copper. Just don't fret the cow." The tavern keeper took her coins and handed her a bowl of soup. Phoenix followed her out to the back door. As they crossed a bare yard to the small barn, he glanced up at the sky and saw she was right about the storm. The barn was no more than another mud and thatch hut, but at least it was shelter. He hadn't even thought about where his hero would sleep for the night. He hadn't thought about a lot of things, apparently. They were silent a while, as Jade sat on a hay bale and finished eating. Phoenix tried to ignore the rather scrawny cow tethered in one corner. Somewhere nearby, a chicken squawked irritably, making him jump. Jade glanced up. Was that thunder? I thought it sounded more like a chicken. Then there was an unmistakable rumble. Phoenix looked out his real bedroom window and saw lightning. "Hang on. You're right. I've got a real storm here. I should probably shut the game down until it passes." "I should too, I suppose. It's turning into a nasty one here," she agreed. "Thanks for helping out in there." She nodded at the tavern. "I guess I've got a lot to learn about the customs of ancient England. Albion, I mean. No big. You helped me, too." He shrugged. "I forgot to add money to my list of equipment." Jade laughed. "What about a horse, then? Surely you've got one. My character wasn't allowed, but yours would be. My virtual feet are killing me." She lifted one boot-shod foot and rubbed it. Phoenix glared, stung by her laughter. He hadn't thought of getting a horse, but that didn't give her the right to laugh at him, especially when he'd just saved one of her lives. The last thing he needed right now was one more person criticizing him. He'd been having fun until she came along. He played computer games to escape from real life, not to have to worry about impressing anyone. He turned away, staring out at the darkening digital sky. A few drops of rain spattered into the dusty yard outside the door. He really wasn't in the right frame of mind for talking, beating up. Bandits had exactly suited his mood. He sighed. Maybe he was overreacting. She seemed nice enough, really. It wasn't her fault he was still angry with Jacob. Mildly irritated that his fun had been spoiled, Phoenix reached up to take the headset off. As he did, something caught his eye in the real world. Looking out the window, he saw a strange sort of shimmery glow shooting down from the heavy storm clouds outside. It looked like slow-motion purple lightning. He watched, fascinated, as it crackled down toward the tree outside his window and lit the thin branches in an eerie glow. Freaky. He shook himself and slid the mouse toward the logout button on the computer. Best to switch it off with an electrical storm around. The lightning began to move again. It twisted around the branches, slipped through the leaves, and wove its way toward the house. Now he started to get worried. Normal lightning did not behave like that. It should have earthed itself on the tree and been gone. It wasn't. Instead, it was now moving up one of the branches that touched the house. Before he could call for help, the light wriggled under his half-open window. He sat perfectly still, totally unable to move or yell. Fearful astonishment held his muscles like a clamp. Suddenly, the whole room was lit by a weird, purple-blue light. It wasn't like a normal lamp, where the light comes from one place and casts shadows. Everything glowed. There were no shadows at all. It wasn't super bright, either. Just really, really weird. And it felt like it was looking for something. Just as that thought crossed Phoenix's mind, the glow condensed into a thin streak of light. He cried out in shock as it zipped straight toward him. He tried desperately to back away, but found he was still sitting in his chair with his VR headset on. Feet tangling in the chair legs, he fell backward. Just before he toppled, the light pierced his chest. He yelled. It was a white-hot needle jabbing him in the ribs. The chair slipped out from beneath him. He hit the floor, and everything went dark. Far away, in the unchanging dark, Long Bayou smiled. A whisper of strength seeped back into his cold, cramped limbs. He raised his heavy head and stared into the blackness. "Come," he murmured. Resting his head on a forearm, he fell into a natural sleep for the first time in many nights. Now he had a chance. In luxurious rooms above, his jailer roared in anger as he, too, sensed a change in the balance. Chapter 4, 80 Level 1. "Phoenix, Phoenix, wake up!" A worried voice dragged him out of sleep. As Phoenix reluctantly opened his eyes, he felt a cool hand on his forehead. Had he overslept? "Mum." He stared vaguely about. His room looked odd. For starters, the plain white ceiling had turned into wooden beams with straw over the top. The bed under his body felt like straw, too. What the? He sat straight up and wished he hadn't. His head ached. His arm hurt, and his stomach turned flip-flops. Swallowing hard, he peered around, trying to work out what was wrong with everything. Okay, he wasn't in his room. That was obvious. Even apart from that, the world looked kind of odd. It was sort of too smooth, too perfect. Yet at the same time, it looked a little bit grainy, like a photo that's been made too big, so you can start to see the little square pixels of color. "Phoenix? Are you all right?" He turned his head toward the voice and his mouth flopped open in shock. It was that character from the computer game, Jade. She was even more beautiful close up. "You're beautiful." He blinked several times, thinking he was seeing things. She blushed, pressing long fingers to red cheeks and glancing down at her well-curved body. She looked about 17. "I know. It's ridiculous." She was obviously uncomfortable. "This body feels all wrong." "Huh?" He reached out a hand and carefully touched her arm. She looked all wrong like the rest of this place, but she felt real. He could feel the rough fabric of her tunic and the warmth of her skin. Did this mean she was a real person and she'd come to visit him for some reason? Had he been struck by the weird lightning? Was he in some sort of hospital? Phoenix glanced about again and dismissed that thought. This was no hospital. Not unless cows had become doctors and chickens nurses. The tiny candle lantern that lit the room was feeble, but he could see clearly enough. 2 fowl roosted in one corner of what was now obviously a barn. A skinny cow munched calmly on hay nearby. Not just any barn, not just any cow. Memory came back, and he gasped aloud at the realization of exactly where he was, but couldn't possibly be. It's the barn behind the tavern. But how? That's a computer game. I don't understand, he complained, grabbing his head as pain shot through it. His left arm throbbed. A bloody scrap of cloth was wound around it. So you feel like it's real too? Jade's expression was both eager and worried. Phoenix looked down. He snatched up a handful of straw and rubbed it on his skin. It still looked too perfect, but it sure felt just like real straw. He sniffed it, then bit it. It smelled and tasted just like straw, too. His stomach lurched again as his senses disagreed with each other and confused his brain. I guess it seems real. Sort of. I just don't understand how. Or why. She slumped down onto the hay bale beside him. 1 minute I was sitting in front of my dad's computer, playing the game. Next minute lightning shoots in the window, and suddenly I'm in the game, and you're lying unconscious on the floor. You've been asleep for ages. That's just what happened to me. Except that I tripped over my chair and hit my head. He agreed. His head still hurt. Gingerly he felt the lump growing on the back of his skull. They sat in silence for a while, feeling overwhelmed, listening to the rain pattering down outside the building. It was warm and dry inside, but it did smell very strongly of cow and dung. Is it my imagination? Jade frowned at the rough wooden walls. Or is it all getting more real looking? Huh? Phoenix squinted around. When I first got here, she said, it all looked sort of computerish. You know, too smooth, too perfect. He nodded, remembering. Long black hair fell in his eyes. He shoved it back impatiently. Now it looks more like the real world, don't you think? She stared about the room, tilting her head to one side. He did the same, wondering if that made a difference. He blinked in astonishment. She was right. All the too smoothness was being replaced by the millions of tiny imperfections that people take for granted in real things. Maybe it was changing, or maybe his mind was filling in the blanks to make it more acceptable. Phoenix didn't know and didn't much care. The unreality of his situation was finally sinking in. He was actually inside the game. He stood up, a little unsteady, as he adjusted to longer, stronger legs. Ignoring the thudding in his head, he looked around with new eyes. He really was inside 80 AD. It wasn't possible. But here he was. Unless it was a dream, there couldn't be any other explanation. It wasn't just an escape from reality anymore. It was reality. A new, better reality. Freaking awesome. We're in the game, he said aloud, staring in wonder at the darkening room. Actually in the game. Do you know what this means? He turned to the player girl, excitement welling up to take the place of bewildered confusion. She stared up at him and shook her head, eyes wide. His left hand fell naturally onto the hilt of his sword. He gripped it and drew it halfway out of the sheath. It means we can live the quest, instead of just pretending to. It means we can kill dragons, beat up the bad guys, get treasure, and basically wreak havoc without any consequences. We can do anything we want. Sweet. This is so totally cool. There was a long silence as Phoenix inspected his sword with satisfaction. He swished it through the air experimentally, enjoying the sound and weight of it. Muscles in his arms bulged impressively. This was going to be so great. How many times had he wished he could do what his game characters could? Now he was his character. Now he could really kick butt. But I don't want to be in the game. Jade's small, worried comment intruded on his enthusiasm. Phoenix paused, looking down at her in surprise. What gamer didn't want to live the game? This was the ultimate escape. How could she not want to be here? Suddenly she seemed a lot younger than her beautiful avatar appeared, and a lot more frightened. He sat down, grinning encouragingly. Come on, it'll be fun. We can steal the Jewel of Asgard, like you're supposed to do in level 1. Who knows, maybe we could even get right through to level 5, kill Feng Judai and win. This is like every gamer's dream. It'll be great. It's just a game. She shook her head. But I only wanted to play for a little while. I've never played games before, really. I don't even know what you're supposed to do. I'd just screw everything up. Phoenix frowned at her, a sudden realization kicking in. Hang on. He pointed at the P on her clothing. You can't be here anyway. She screwed up her nose and shook her head again. What are you talking about? I thought we'd already established that. The fact that we're in a computer game is just impossible, but it's happened and we're stuck with it. No. He waved her words aside impatiently. I mean, you can't be here. You're another player. So? He slapped his forehead at her obtuseness, then forced himself to calm down. She'd said she didn't play games much, so she obviously didn't understand. 88 is a pre-release game. It means we can all have limited access to it on the internet servers. But the game isn't ready for full multi-level multiplayer interactive playing yet. Players shouldn't be able to see each other at all. Experimentally, he prodded her arm. You must just be a digital construct. You can't be a player. Ow! She poked him back, scowling. Of course I am. Maybe you're not the real one. Don't be ridiculous, he scoffed. She kept glaring, so he held up his hands. Okay, let's prove it. We can both think of something that was on the news today as proof that we've come from the real world. They did so, Phoenix recalling a story about the latest football grand final, Jade relating one about a whaling ship sinking off Japan. Convinced of their own realnesses, if not that of their current world, they both sank back onto the hay bales. Phoenix's earlier elation seeped back into his scattered thoughts, like water finding its way through cracks in a dam. He was in the game. Weird or not, this was just too good an opportunity to miss. He hefted the sword again, a grin of anticipation stretching his mouth. Do you know what this means? He turned back to Jade, eager for her to be as excited as he was. You've already asked me that, she sighed. He ignored her lack of enthusiasm. It means we've got at least 48 hours to kick butt before the game is opened up to the world, and we get swamped with other players. He stood up again, swishing the sword and striking what he hoped were warrior-like poses. 48 hours of fun. Each word was punctuated by a strike at an invisible foe. I just want to go home. Jade hunched her shoulders and turned her head away. He stared at her, his mouth half open in shock. He dropped back onto the bale beside her, his mind suddenly overwhelmed with images and ideas. What? She grabbed his shoulder, seeming worried when he just sat there with his mouth open. What is it? Have you thought of a way to get us home? Phoenix shook his head. But when you said home, I suddenly realized I remember everything. He touched his aching head in wonder. It seemed full and felt bigger than he recalled. With longer hair, he fingered the scar on his cheek. The scar he'd put on his avatar's face only hours before. That was the moment he fully realized that the body he occupied now was not his usual awkward half-grown teenage one. It was his computer-generated warrior one. What do you mean, everything? Jade blinked at him. I remember everything about being me. Phoenix Carter from Cambridge, England. He pointed to his own chest, and I remember everything about being him, Phoenix the warrior. He slapped his new body, really feeling hard muscles for the first time. I remember wandering about the woods this afternoon, fighting bandits. I remember growing up in a little village near Bedford and training for years with my uncle to be a swordsman. The game gave my character a life history when I created him. Phoenix shook his head. Now I have both lives in my head, and it's confusing the hell out of me. My brain's full. Oh. Jade's reply was thoughtful. I see what you mean. Now that I think about it, I have the same stuff. My character grew up in the great forest to the west. I even remember the spells she knows and what herbs grow around here. Wow, I even remember eating that stew from the tavern. She made a face and pretended to throw up. Phoenix couldn't help but smile a little as he glanced at her. He spotted Jade's pointed ears and pale blonde hair and realized her character was an elf. They were very magical, according to the game rules. That gave him an idea. You said you know some spells, he suggested. If you want to go home so much, why don't you just try magicking yourself back? She shook her head with a sigh. I'm only a half-elf and a minor spellweaver. I know lots of small spells for healing and a few minor curses to use against enemies, but nothing big like that. She trailed off, frowning at him. He wondered if his expression betrayed his utter lack of understanding of anything magical. It must have, for she pulled out a small bag and carefully selected 2 small leaves from inside. Crushing them in her palm, she mixed in a little water from her water skin. Closing her eyes, she laid her hand on his bandaged arm. He started to pull away. She grabbed him and held him still. Just comfrey leaves. Watch. A spiky, tingling warmth started under her palm. A faint, purple-blue shimmer wavered around her fingers like a heat haze. The warmth spread up his arm, into his shoulder. Then it stopped. Jade took her hand away and tugged the bandage off. Phoenix blinked in surprise, the smooth skin beneath. It was smeared with blood, but undamaged. He flexed his fingers. Way cool, he approved. Thanks. That will sure come in handy here. I told you, I don't want to stay here, she repeated forcefully. I like reading books, but I'm not hero material. I'm just me. She drooped again, staring morosely at her own boots. Hey, don't stress. It'll be okay. Phoenix put on his best reassuring voice. I'll take care of you. He slid his sword back into its scabbard carefully, trying not to slice his own thumb off. It's getting dark. We'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll work something out. There was silence for a while, except for the spatter of drizzling rain and chewing noises from the cow. Jade straightened suddenly, turning her head toward the open door. Did you hear something? She whispered, gripping Phoenix's newly healed arm with surprising strength. He listened hard, then shook his head. Just chickens again. It's your imagination. No, she said. I heard something. Elves have better hearing. There's someone outside, sneaking. So what do we do? He felt suddenly breathless, heart racing. It was one thing to watch this stuff on a flat screen. She frowned at him. I don't know. You're the warrior, aren't you? You just said you'd take care of me. Stung, he stood up, drawing his sword again with an ominous shing of metal on metal. Swallowing hard, he faced the door. Right. You stay back. I'll protect you. He tried to ignore the kernel of doubt in his mind. Could he actually use this sword effectively? Would he know how? After a moment, Jade stepped up beside him, face pale, knuckles white as she held her staff ready. There's more than one. I think you'll need help. Phoenix glanced at her doubtfully. He couldn't help feeling a little relieved, but she looked like she might faint at any minute. He didn't think. There was no more time to think. 3 peasants slid into the room, their eyes glinting with greed. Wearing rough homespun clothing that was distinctly worse for wear, they crept in on bare feet and carried an assortment of ill-kept, notch-bladed knives and axes. They looked more poverty-stricken than professional. A 4th man appeared, his right hand swathed in dirty bandages. Phoenix groaned and took a firm grip on his sword hilt, eyeing the weasel-faced man in disgust. "Not you again. I see you have some new friends," he mocked. "Didn't the other guys want to get beaten by a girl again?" "Give us your coin, girl, and you can go free," Weasley ordered, ignoring him. He wasn't holding a weapon now, but he looked the sort to have an extra knife hidden somewhere in his baggy clothes. A knife that he would use left-handed if necessary. Phoenix wondered how he knew that. Jade shifted her weight and he brought his attention back where it belonged. This was no time to get distracted. From the corner of his eye, Phoenix saw her hand begin to move toward her belt pouch. He nudged her with an elbow and shook his head. Something told him these men were not open to easy solutions. They were desperate. This was not going to end well. "You've taken these guys once, remember? We can do it again," he murmured. "That was her, not me," she hissed, her voice strained with fear. "You are her now," he reminded her. "You know what to do. Just let it happen. They'd kill us anyway. The Romans are law around here, and they're afraid we'll report them." She paused, nodded, and tightened her hold on the staff. The thief leader's eyes narrowed. He jerked his head at his companions. "Right then, if that's the way you want it, have at them, lads." With no more warning, the 4 peasants launched their attack. As though planned, they split up and moved to encircle the pair. Jade and Phoenix turned back to back, waiting. "You okay?" Phoenix asked softly, feeling her tremble. "What do you think?" she replied acidly. One man ran at her, swinging his own short staff in an arc toward her ribs. "No, I want to go home." Each word was punctuated with a sharp crack as her staff found its mark 6 times in quick succession. Relieved that she seemed to still be able to use her weapon and wasn't going to have hysterics, Phoenix gave in to the flood of adrenaline that pumped through his body. He grinned at the 2 attackers facing him. His new body automatically dropped into a fighter's crouch, shield slung on his left arm, sword ready in his right. Then, for a brief moment, he felt confused and wondered if he ought to use Aikido instead. He half stood, ready to move into an Aikido fighting stance. One half of his mind fought with the other. The warrior part proved stronger in this new body. It took over, thrusting the real-world Phoenix's impulses aside. He dropped back into the crouch, grinning. "Let them come." The small man hung back, watching as his bigger companion swung a blunt Roman sword at Phoenix's head. This peasant obviously had little training. Phoenix watched, waiting until the last second. Then he took a half-step forward and to the right, turning just enough to deflect the descending blade with his shield and bring his own sword down in a deadly stroke that sliced the man from shoulder to opposite hip. The peasant dropped his sword and staggered a couple of steps back, clutching at his belly in horror before collapsing to the hay-strewn floor. He twitched once, then lay still, eyes open. Momentarily stunned, Phoenix the boy surfaced and gulped. Nausea twisted his stomach. He'd killed someone. The 3rd man rushed him with a wooden club, and the warrior took over again. He dodged instinctively, turning to chop at an exposed neck as the man stumbled past. He, too, fell to the hay-strewn floor, and was clearly not going to get up. Behind, He heard the hollow thwack of wood on skull, followed by the thump of a large body hitting the ground. Sounded like Jade taking care of her adversary. He looked around. The smaller man had disappeared. A small stifled shriek made him spin quickly, only to see the weaselly man standing next to Jade. His blade glinted at her throat. Wide-eyed, she dropped her staff and put her hands up. Weasel Face grinned. "That's the way, lassie. You too." He nodded pleasantly to Phoenix. "Put the sticker down, or she dies." Something in his voice told Phoenix the man was not joking. "Do it," she whispered. "It's just money. We don't know what would happen if we get killed." Phoenix hesitated, wondering what would happen if he disobeyed. The game rules said they were supposed to have 7 lives. But did that apply now that they were actually in the game? It was only a pre-release, after all. What would happen if they were killed here? Would their real bodies die in the real world? A cold sense of foreboding swept through his body, leaving him shaky. Slowly, he laid the sword down. Good choice. Now, the thief sliced the leather tying Jade's money pouch to her belt and hefted the little bag in his hand. With a smile of satisfaction, he began to back away. Phoenix watched with mounting anger. This was not how it was supposed to go. This was his game. He was the hero. He wasn't going to be beaten so easily by some grubby little git. Perhaps seeing the red light of rage building in his face, the little man shook his head warningly. "Now then, I'm letting her live, aren't I? Surely her life is worth this little bundle." He tucked the bag into his belt, watching Phoenix as he edged away. "Besides, I can tell you what would happen if you got killed. You die. End of story." Unable to contain the burning anger, Phoenix took a step forward. Jade cried a warning. The thief flipped the knife over, holding it by the blade as he retreated. Heedless, Phoenix snatched up his sword and stalked after him. Their attacker slipped into the darkness with a grin. Phoenix growled, low in his throat, ran to the door and yelled after him. "I'll get you, you coward!" A faint laugh floated back through the night. The blade flew out of the gloom to bury itself deep into Phoenix's left shoulder. Staring numbly at the protruding handle, he turned towards Jade. She covered her mouth as if to stop a scream escaping. His shield slipped from a lax hand and clattered to the earthen floor. Pain exploded in his shoulder. He staggered back, astonished, groping for support. His heel caught in a loop of rope left on the floor. Jade screamed his name as he fell. His head hit the packed earth. The world darkened and vanished. Chum. Chapter 5. Phoenix. Phoenix, wake up, please. Jade knelt anxiously over the fallen warrior, slapping his face lightly and experiencing a strong sense of déjà vu. Biting her lip, she frowned down at him. She had done her best. The knife was out, his wound healed to a faint scar. Why wouldn't he wake up? She didn't want to be left alone here. Night had fallen, and the small barn jumped with shadows cast by the tiny, flickering candle lantern. It no longer seemed a safe, innocent haven in this bizarre world. 2 of their attackers were definitely dead, the third probably as well. They had to leave. She pushed open his coarse woolen shirt, searching for other wounds. Maybe she'd missed one. A glitter at his throat caught her eye, and she gasped. Her necklace. She fumbled at her own neck, finding the slim chain she had clasped on only hours before. No, her own teardrop amulet was still there. She tugged it out and craned her neck to stare at it, then looked closely at Phoenix's. It wasn't the same. In fact, they looked like 2 pieces of a puzzle, as if they should fit together. But how could they even be here, in this reality? Why did he have one too? What did it mean? Her sharp ears caught 2 voices at some distance outside, one light and familiar. the weasel-faced man who had stolen her purse, the other deeper and lower-pitched. She slipped to the door and peered out into the darkness. The rain had eased, and the cloud cover was breaking, allowing faint moonlight to illuminate the small courtyard between the inn and its outbuildings. With her elven eyesight, Jade could just make out what seemed to be 3 people, 2 larger men struggling together, a third, smaller figure, off to one side, watching. A knife blade gleamed in the moonlight. What was happening? What if more thugs were coming? What was she supposed to do with Phoenix out cold? Scuffled footfalls on wet earth were followed by a soft, muffled moan and the squishy thump of a body hitting slushy ground. One of the men was down. The other stood over him, hands on hips. He kicked the fallen figure. It didn't move. The smaller person sauntered forward, fingers reaching, perhaps for a pulse. There was some low-voiced conversation she couldn't quite make out. The taller man pointed back toward the barn before striding away into the inn. At that moment, Phoenix groaned, moving his head restlessly. Jade ran back to him, still casting quick looks. At the door, his blue eyes opened and stared blankly at the thatched roof. Realization flooded into his face, and he sat up so fast he almost clashed heads with her. Pushing a long lock of hair back, he looked around in wide-eyed astonishment. It wasn't a dream. I'm still here. He blinked at her, then poked a finger at his shoulder, obviously relieved to find it undamaged. Thanks. She nodded absently. A new noise had drawn her attention. It was hard to tell what was going on, but it sounded like something heavy being dragged toward the barn by someone who grunted a lot and slipped in the mud frequently. "There's someone coming," she whispered. He grimaced. "Man, what is this place, Grand Central Station? Where's my sword gone?" Clambering to his feet, he grabbed the weapon and faced the opening again. Jade picked up her staff, feeling sick at the memory of how easily she had cracked heads last time. "Hello, the house?" A light, cheerful greeting floated through the door. It didn't sound like someone intent on attacking them. There were a few more grunts. The straining back and shoulders of a very grubby short person appeared in the half-lit entranceway. Whoever it was, they were dragging the muddy and bloody remains of the weasel-faced man who had stolen Jade's purse moments before. A few more feet and the newcomer dropped the body with an exaggerated sigh of relief. It flopped unpleasantly onto the floor. It was hard to tell through all the mud, but the carrier seemed to be a young boy. Turning to face them, he grinned impishly, showing 2 missing teeth. Jade relaxed a little. He didn't seem dangerous. He looked to be around 10 years old, wiry but small for his age. His skin was sunburned nut brown, and his sparkling brown eyes were almost hidden behind a thick fringe of dark auburn hair. The much-patched homespun clothes he wore were 2 sizes too big, and his feet were bare. "You're the kitchen boy," Phoenix cried, and she suddenly recognized the impudent youngster from the bar earlier. The boy grinned. "Sometimes." He held out a hand. Jade's purse lay on it. She took it, hefting it as she eyed the boy. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Bryn, the lighter," he replied with a quick bow. Jade exchanged a glance with Phoenix, who smiled. "Bryn the thief, are you?" She returned wryly. "Is that why my purse is lighter now?" The boy shrugged, quirking a grin. "Call it a fee for getting it back. Now." He turned away and began matter-of-factly to search the bodies for more loot. Jade looked on in horrified astonishment. When he was done, Bryn had collected a reasonable dagger, a bronze bracelet, and a few other small pieces, which he stored in apparently endless pockets. She snatched up her pack and cloak before he could rifle through them too. The boy reviewed the carnage they had created. You might want to consider finding somewhere else to lay up for the night and get out of the village fast tomorrow. He picked up the small candle lantern and extracted the lit candle. Shadows jumped as the flame flickered in the breeze. Why? Jade glanced around, bewildered. Bryn tossed the candle into the nearest pile of dry hay. Because the barn is going to have an unfortunate accident and burn down. Oh. He pointed at the dead man he'd dragged in. And because he's an informant for the Romans. He's already sent word to Londinium about you. Governor Agricola's chief comite will send troops. They'll be here by mid-morning, but tomorrow. Flames began to eat their way up the dry haystack toward the timber walls. Bryn strolled over and untied the cow, turning to lead her out of the barn. He paused, blinking at them in surprise. You're still here? You killed that man and now you're burning down the barn to hide the bodies, Jade blurted, overwhelmed by the speed with which events were unfolding. He gave a one-shouldered shrug. Actually, you killed those three and Lou, the innkeeper, killed the other guy. I just dragged the body in. If you're lucky, once the barn burns, the Romans will think two of them are you and stop chasing you. I don't like your chances, though. The Romans are pretty keen to be rid of your folk. Her folk? Phoenix voiced her next question for her. Bryn tugged on the rope, towing the protesting cow past leaping flames. A chicken flew past his head, squawking indignantly. Why toll with Teg? You know, he frowned at their blank looks. The fair folk of the forests, elves, wood nymphs, and the like. The Romans hate you because you try to help our people against them. But, Jade began, then coughed as smoke billowed up and flames began to take serious hold of the barn. Maybe we should talk about this somewhere else. Phoenix grabbed her arm and towed her outside. Bryn slapped the cow on the rump. It mooed. Jade hurried to keep up. The boy seemed to be the only person who was willing and able to give them any sort of insight into this world. When he turned around from tying the cow to a post behind the inn, Bryn saw them hovering and sighed. He cocked his head, put his hands on skinny hips and pursed his lips. All right then. There's an abandoned house on the edge of the woods west of town. You can stay there tonight. You're obviously new to town, so I'll give you some tips. He paused, casting a sly look from beneath long lashes. For a fee, of course, with the light of fire leaping behind and the sound of voices upraised in alarm close on their heels, Bryn led them silently through darkened fields, into the night. After close on half an hour, as far as Jade could tell, a dark, regular shape loomed. He slipped in, and soon a faint, flickering light beckoned them to join him. As they entered, she realized that although the farmhouse was obviously abandoned, someone had chosen to make it their home. Against one curved wall huddled a straw bed, and a small fire crackled cheerfully in a central hearth. A few broken pieces of pottery and poorly repaired chairs were a feeble attempt at homemaking. Phoenix opened his mouth as though to comment. Jade elbowed him sharply. He shot her a frown, then shut his mouth as she shook her head. For some reason, Bryn was living here, alone by the looks of it. It wouldn't be polite to say anything. The boy waved them in. Make yourself at home. I've got to go back and make sure Lou gets the fire out all right. I'll hoot like an owl when I return. Keep the door and windows shut to hide the light. He vanished back into the darkness, leaving Jade and Phoenix to stare at the closed door. Jade sank to the ground beside the fire, warming her chilled hands. After a moment, Phoenix did the same, his leather greaves and body armor creaking. They were silent for a while, numb more than relaxed. Eventually, Jade gathered her thoughts and asked the question uppermost on her mind. Do you think we'll be able to get home soon? She said it now, with little hope of a positive answer. Phoenix shrugged, not seeming particularly concerned one way or the other. Dunno. I don't know how we got here in the first place. She pulled out the chain around her neck. Maybe it has something to do with these. I noticed you've got one too, and I remember thinking that weird lightning had somehow stabbed me right in the chest when it brought me here. With a choked gasp, he tugged out his own and glared at her. Where did you get that? It belonged to my father. It disappeared when he died 3 years ago. Frightened by the anger in his expression, Jade hurriedly explained how she'd found it. He frowned. If that's true, then you're probably right. Somehow these amulets brought us into the game, which means we must need them to get back out. It just doesn't make sense, though. Which bit? She said with heavy irony. The fact that we were brought here by magic amulets, or the fact that we're now inside the bloodthirsty sword and sorcery digital fantasy game we thought we were just playing for a bit of fun. Both, I suppose. He smiled, fingering the smooth face of his sword blade. You have to admit it's more fun on the inside than the outside, though, huh? You have a warped sense of fun, Jade grimaced, going back to staring into the flames. They sat in silence for a while, absorbed by the dancing orange lights. Jade sat up straight, excited as a new possibility occurred to her. Maybe could we contact other players for help to get home? Phoenix narrowed his blue eyes, then shook his head slowly. Probably not a good idea. If you were an adult and a kid came to you with some story about kids being stuck in a computer game, would you believe them? She slumped again. Guess not. Besides, he added, I told you we're on our own for another couple of days. There aren't any other players here yet. Not until the full release. Heck, we shouldn't even be able to see each other. So what do we do? She asked, not really expecting any sort of useful answer out of him. He seemed determined to stay. Well, he spread his hands. We can make the best of it. Maybe we're here because we're supposed to play the game. Maybe that's the only way to get home. What? Her voice came out as a strangled squeak. All 5 levels? That's insane. Maybe it's just this one level, Phoenix said soothingly. Maybe we just have to steal the Jewel of Asgard from Stonehenge. That's the task for level 1. Maybe once we do that, and the full release is opened up, we'll automatically go home. Jade wrapped her arms around herself. That's a whole lot of maybes. She waved a hand back toward the village. We nearly got killed in the first half hour of level 1. I've hardly ever played these things on the outside, let alone on the inside. There's no way I'm good enough to win 1 level, let alone 5. She glared at him, then pointed an accusing finger. You just want to do it because you like computer games and you think this is fun. Turning away from his guilty expression, she wrapped her cloak around her body and stared moodily into the fire. She was tired, hungry, and scared. There was no way she was going to play through the whole game to kill Feng Judai, on the off chance that it would take her home. Her limited spellweaver skills would be hopelessly outmatched by the arch-wizard arch-bad guy. There had to be another way. Phoenix was silent a while, poking a stick into the coals. I suppose you're right. It's just... He poked again, causing a shower of sparks to fly up, then sighed. I'd really like to try, you know. I hate my real life. This one might be... better. Better. Jade gaped at him, appalled. Getting attacked, stabbed, thieved, and chased for weeks would be better. Man, your life must really suck. He shrugged, and there was a long, awkward silence. Besides, she added, trying another tack, what's happening to the real us while we're in here trying to win? And what would happen if we lost all our lives? If this is the pre-release version, do we even have 7 lives? Then there's the fact that we don't even know what this Jewel of Asgard is. How can we steal what we don't know anything about? There's just no chance. There's got to be another way to get home. Even to her own ears, Jade sounded more and more like she was trying to convince herself. The worst of it was, she had a growing conviction that Phoenix was probably right. In every book she'd read, the heroes had to complete their quest. No matter how they tried to avoid it, they always ended up confronting the ultimate bad guy in the end. This game was, after all, programmed by people who probably read the same books she did. An owl hooted outside. They both jumped. Phoenix laid his hand on his sword. The door opened just enough to admit Bryn's thin body. He slipped in and joined them by the fire. "Right," he said, pulling out a piece of what looked like beef jerky to gnaw on. "Fire's out. Everyone's gone to bed. You're safe for the moment. So here's the deal. You answer my questions. I answer yours. Yes?" Jade nodded. "Where are you from?" He waved the jerky around as though to indicate the world outside the hut. They both answered easily enough, using their avatar lives. He nodded, handing around the meat and indicating it was their turn to ask. "Where's your family?" she asked, nibbling on the tough meat. A shadow passed across his mobile face. "Killed by Romans 3 months ago. Where are you going next?" Jade glanced at Phoenix for guidance. "We're not sure. We're trying to get home, but it's complicated." "So why do you want the Jewel of Asgard?" Bryn shot at them. They gaped. "How?" she gasped. Phoenix frowned and reached for his sword. The boy edged away, hands sliding for his own dagger. "Don't get touchy. I heard some of your talk before I came in. You said something about stealing the jewel. Why?" "Why does it matter?" Phoenix returned. Bryn eyed them, apparently assessing them in some way. He nodded once, as if he'd come to a decision. "It matters because the Romans are after it too. Word is that Governor Agricola sent out a full cohort of men to get it. He's been told that whoever has the jewel holds the key to ruling Albion. He'll stop at nothing to get it. Since you're clearly not Romans, I'd rather you got it than him. If you want it, you'll have to move fast." Chapter 6. "It's pretty obvious we don't have a choice anymore," Phoenix insisted. He had dragged Jade outside into the chilly night to discuss their situation away from Bryn's sharp ears. "If our only way home is by completing the quests, then we have to get the jewel before the Romans do." "If," she hissed back at him. Her breath condensed into a cloud. "That's a big if. We haven't even looked for another way home." "Come on, Jade, seriously." Phoenix shook his head. "Do you really truly believe there's an easy way out of this? Do you really think someone or something went to all the trouble to get us here, just to let us go for the asking? Face it, this is a game, and we have to play our way out. Now we have a deadline too. If we don't get the jewel before the Romans, we really will be stuck here. Our only chance to get to level 2, or home," he amended hastily as she turned furious green eyes on him, "is to steal the jewel from the druids at Stonehenge. That's what the rules say." "I don't know." Jade began to pace, her outline dimly lit by the cloud-shrouded glow of an almost full moon overhead. She wrung her hands together. "I just wish there was some way of knowing for sure what we have to do. A sign or something to tell us we're on the right track. Then I would do whatever it takes, I guess." Phoenix raised an eyebrow. She seemed more likely worry and think something to death than actually do anything. He'd rather just get out there and get going. All this talking was giving him a headache. He opened his mouth to say so, but she interrupted. "Hey, your pendant is glowing." Startled, he looked down. There was a faint, purplish light glimmering through the thick wool of his shirt. He drew it out, squinting down at it. "Mine is too," she added. "Maybe if we, fit them together like a puzzle and wish really hard, it will get us home." Phoenix doubted it, but he was willing to humor her if it would make her focus on playing out level 1. He unclasped his chain, and they fitted the two halves together, holding them gingerly as though they were going to explode. He had a feeling it was going to take a lot more than wishing to get them home again, and to be honest, he didn't mind if they stayed a while. Nothing happened. Jade sighed, her hopeful expression fading. Well, it was worth a flash of purple-blue light seared their eyes, illuminating the astonished look on her face. It coalesced into a small, perfectly formed image that hovered in the darkness above the amulet like a hologram. "Is that Stonehenge?" she whispered, sounding awed. They both stared at it. It looked wrong, somehow. "Oh, all the stones are there. That's why it looks weird." She poked a finger through the translucent, complete stone circles. The image vanished. She jerked her finger back. Phoenix blinked, waiting for his eyes to readjust. The amulet under his fingers was warm. Catching Jade's eye, he shrugged ruefully. "You asked for a sign. I'd say that qualifies, wouldn't you?" Her mouth moved, but he couldn't hear any sound. He shook his head as a distant roaring surged into his mind, blotting out any words. Sudden heat radiated from the amulets, still clasped in their joined fingers. He watched in horror as Jade's eyes rolled up in her head. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed to the cold ground, dragging him with her. He couldn't release her hand or his amulet. Darkness claimed him. Again. This time, it was different. This wasn't the brief darkness of unconsciousness. Phoenix opened his eyes to a gray, formless world of nothing. Beneath his body, the ground felt soft, but there was nothing to see, nothing with which to orientate himself or get a sense of up and down. Distance and time were meaningless. Gray encompassed all. Abruptly and without actually moving, he stood upright. Jade's hand was still clasped in his, their amulets still joined. He couldn't let go. Around their hands danced that same purple-blue light he'd come to associate with magic in the game realm. So where were they now? He glanced at Jade. She shook her head, her eyes both frightened and hopeful. "Home," she mouthed. He shrugged. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was some sort of between world through which they could find their way home. He closed his eyes, half reluctantly. His visualization of home wasn't particularly sharp or enthusiastic, so he wasn't surprised when the gray world was still there after he opened them. Jade's shoulders slumped. A sudden subconscious tension made him reach for his sword, only to find it missing. His dagger was gone too. His curses fell silently into the absorbing, lightless world. He tried to wrench his hand free of Jade's, but couldn't do that either. Looking at her, Phoenix saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. A gray-cloaked figure appeared, seeming to coalesce from within the featureless stuff surrounding them. Phoenix bunched up a fist, wondering if it would even connect here. Lean but stoop-shouldered, the figure radiated intense power. At the same time, it seemed forlorn and tired. The face lay shadowed in a deep cowl. Phoenix had the impression of age, pain, and a hint of desperation. "We have only a few moments before I must return. I am not strong enough for this anymore." Thin and faintly amused, the voice sounded directly into Phoenix's head, bypassing his ears altogether. He blinked in surprise and felt Jade's clutch on his fingers tighten. "Who are you?" Jade's thought voice sounded much younger than her normal one. Phoenix wondered if it was her real-world voice he heard in his head. The gray figure made a hasty movement, as though rejecting her question. "The joining of your amulets gave me a small window of opportunity to speak with you. Do not waste time in useless questions." Listen." When they did not interrupt, the voice continued. "You have been brought here to do what we cannot. You must stop Feng Judai. This world and your own depend on it. If you fail, both worlds are lost. If you fail, your otherworld bodies will die. Your lives there will be forfeit, and your world altered beyond comprehension if Feng Judai succeeds in his ultimate plan." Witness. With a wave of one knotted white hand, images began to appear directly in Phoenix's mind. He gasped in shock, clutching at his head with his free hand. It was like watching a montage of all the worst war films and horror movies. Half disbelieving, he saw his school go up in flames, his house a tumbled ruin, his mother dragged, screaming, into a small cell. On a broader scale, he saw catastrophic wars across generations and continents, ages of chaos and slavery. Above and beyond all, controlling the world like a puppeteer, hovered a shadowy figure in black. Feng Judai. Abruptly, the scenes vanished, leaving strange, red after images dancing in the air. They were still in the gray limbo world. The hooded figure before them drooped, as though drained of what little energy it had. Phoenix caught a glimpse of pale skin and a pain-pinched mouth. "I will return you to Albion. The first step you must take to stop Judai is to get the Jewel of Asgard before Agricola does. He will strike on the equinox, when the keepers of the jewel are at their strongest and also at their weakest. The equinox." It was Jade's thought, and Phoenix heard the fear underscoring it. But that's at least 5 or 6 days away. If Phoenix is right, we have less than 2 days before this whole game. World is overrun with more players. That's not enough time. I just want to go home. The hint of a laugh brushed across his mind. Time. Time does not run as quickly at this end of the continuum. A day here is as a few hours in your own world. You will have time, if you are wise. If you truly wish to go home, then this is your only path. But we don't even know where the jewel is. Jade's anguished wail interrupted. "Did you not see the stone temple, girl? That is where you will find the jewel and its keepers." But no more questions. The white hand, held up to forestall Jade's thoughts, shook. "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. You must get the jewel first, or Feng Judai will wrest it from the Romans and be strengthened by its power. With the jewel in his hands, he will be almost unstoppable. He will lay waste to this world and yours." Indeed, the figure seemed to sigh. "The home you knew will never have existed. Do not mistake. What you do here will affect your world as much as this one. This game is nothing more than a portal through which you have been drawn. This world is real in its own way. Let neither the jewel nor your amulets fall into Judai's hands if you ever wish to return home. Protect the jewel. Protect the amulets. Stop Judai. You are our only hope now. Go." The hand waved again. The gray world blinked out of existence. Phoenix found himself lying on the half-frozen ground, staring up at a million sparkling stars overhead. A fleeting, almost inconsequential thought crossed his mind. He'd never seen so many stars. The Milky Way arced overhead in a glittering sweep of humbling distance and beauty. Beneath his fingers, Phoenix felt the cold, damp earth. He crumbled a lump of dirt into its gritty components. It felt real. The stars looked real. Springtime scents, and the first hint of dew on his skin seemed real. Could it actually be real? Images of destruction and despair flashed again behind his eyes. Could it be true? Could the game's archenemy actually destroy his own world? No, this was just a game. He was inside a game. A small part of his mind laughed, mocking his own thoughts. He could believe he was part of a computer game, but not that it was actually another world, as real as his own. Why believe one, but not the other? They were equally outrageous ideas. There was certainly no technology in his own world that could put him inside a computer simulation like this. All that was left to explain it was the magic of this one. Somehow, someone in this world had reached across time and space to pull him and Jade in. Why them? A groan broke into his thoughts. Beside him, Jade clambered to her feet, swaying as she brushed dirt off her cloak and breeches. She reached a hand down. He took it and hauled himself upright. They stood in silence for a moment. Then she raised her head and stared about her like she saw the place afresh. A strange, unreadable expression flickered across her face. She turned huge, worried eyes on him. "This is real." Her strangled whisper was barely audible. Phoenix got a tight grip on his own spiraling uncertainties and feigned a casual shrug. Seems so. For a given value of real, I guess. Real enough, anyway. Who can tell? We don't know if that guy was telling the truth. He tried a grin, hoping it didn't look too stretched. She managed a small, lopsided smile. He could tell her heart wasn't in it. Frowning, she slipped her necklace back on, turned and began to walk toward Bryn's little thatched house. "I guess you're happy now," she muttered. "You get your wish to stay and play the game out." Phoenix snorted, feeling his heart rate slow a little. "I wanted to play a game, not feel like the survival of the entire world rested on my shoulders. It wasn't supposed to turn out to be real, just a bit of fun." Light-hearted though his words were, he felt the solidness of them settle uncomfortably in his guts. He'd wanted an escape from responsibility, yet here he was taking on more than ever. When Jade didn't reply, he glanced across at her. Her smooth brow was marred by two deep shadowed frown lines. "You okay?" She flashed him a quick, haunted look. "I suppose so. I guess I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. This means we do have to play this through. Of course, maybe we don't have to do all 5 levels. Maybe if we stop Judai from getting the jewel, that will be enough and we'll be sent home at the end of level 1. Oh, I don't know." She paused, twisting her hands together in agitation. "It just seems too hard. I just want to go home." Phoenix didn't know what to say, so he wisely staying silent. He still wanted to stay, even with the added responsibility. This was still way more exciting than homework and being grounded. Finally, Jade sighed, flinging her arms wide. Who was that anyway? How do we know she wasn't just one of Feng Judai's flunkies? How do we know that this world will affect ours? She. He blinked at her in surprise. It was an old woman. Now it was her turn to look surprised. "Couldn't you tell?" He shook his head. "Man, woman, whatever. The point is, Judai's hardly going to send one of his own people to tell us to stop him at all costs, is he?" "I suppose not." She made a frustrated noise and wrapped her arms across her chest. "I just don't know if I can do it. She said our real bodies will die if we fail. What if I can't handle it? What if I let you down? I can't save the world. I'm just a kid. I don't even know what to expect." Phoenix shrugged. "Do you ever know? That's life, isn't it? If you knew everything in advance, it'd be pretty boring." He really didn't understand her. How could anyone function always worrying about what might happen? You just coped as things came up, didn't you? But I'd be able to prepare for it. Make plans, get ready. Her voice rose plaintively. "Get a grip, Jade." He grabbed her arm, losing patience with her worrying. "This is only level 1. I'm sure we can handle it. Look how well you used your staff and healing powers. Just don't think about it so much. Use your character's skills and yours. All we have to do is get to Stonehenge and steal the jewel before the Romans get it." Just focus on that." The resigned, fretful expression on Jade's face showed she was far from happy with the situation. "But we don't know where we are, or where Stonehenge is from here, or what the jewel itself is. How are we supposed to steal it? Who are these keepers? How are we supposed to stop Feng Zhudai from capturing it, us and our amulets? We have to have some sort of plan." "Well," Phoenix grinned in the darkness, "there's a ready-made local guide and thief just sitting inside waiting for us. We could ask him for help. The rulebook did say we could each choose a companion." "But—" Jade stopped, staring at the closed door. "He's a kid and a thief. He gave your purse back and he's helped us tonight, hasn't he? Besides," he said, tasting a hint of his own bitterness, "I'd say he's grown up pretty fast as an orphan in this world. Let's go back inside, see what he says, huh?" Chapter 7. "So what do you say?" Phoenix held his fingers out to the fire and across glanced at Bryn. "Will you guide us? For a fee, of course." The grin he sent Jade was ironic. She frowned at him. "To this Stonehenge place?" Bryn raised his eyebrows. "Well, normally I'd say yes, especially to the fee." He flicked a cheeky grin at Phoenix. "I've worn out my welcome in this village. With the Romans coming tomorrow, it's time to move on anyway. The only problem is I've never heard of Stonehenge." "Sorry." Jade moved closer, deciding she'd have to get involved. She picked up a stick and began to draw in the packed earth floor. She drew a long, wiggly line and 2 dots. She pointed to 1 dot. "This is Londinium." She looked at Bryn, who tilted his head to examine the drawing, then nodded. "So this is the River Thames." She indicated the wiggly line. Bryn frowned, then his face cleared to understanding. "Oh, the Ploanida, you mean? The wide river. They only call it the Thames upstream, where it's narrower." She pointed to the other dot. "This is where we need to go. Stonehenge. That's where the jewel is." The boy grinned. "You mean the Karega Amgarn? Why didn't you say so?" "The stone circle," Jade translated aloud. "Yeah, that must be it. Can you take us there?" "Of course," Bryn nodded. "I went there 2 years ago, when we took my brother to join the Druids." He took the stick and drew another set of lines, one paralleling the river and another crossing it and turning south. "We won't be able to take the road for long, though. The main one along the river is patrolled by Romans. We'll have to go through the woods until we get to the ford. It'll mean going through the Brenau." He paused, looking straightly at the pair, clearly expecting a gasp of shock. It translated to dark woods, but must mean something far more sinister to him. When they just looked blank, he explained. "The forest folk of Brenau don't take kindly to intruders. What with the Romans chopping down their trees lately, they like to lead travelers astray with illusions and tricks. There are all sorts of nasties in the deepest parts. It won't be an easy passage." "Of course it won't," Jade sighed, casting a resigned glance at Phoenix. He grinned back at her, patting his sword. They set watches that night, at Jade's insistence. Their run-in with the local thieves had made her skittish. Not that she slept much, anyway. Instead, she spent most of the night alternating between miserably missing her father and doing her best to understand the new body, memories and skills at her disposal. This was the adventure she had always read about, wished herself into. Now that it was really happening, she was terrified. It was all much harder, grubbier, and nastier than she'd ever expected. She was stuck in a frightening, violent world, and there seemed to be no way out, except to play the game through to the end. An end they now had to race the Romans to reach. Finally, close to dawn, she fell into an uneasy sleep. Her last waking thought was that if she were very lucky, this would all turn out to have been a dream when she woke. Her sleep was haunted by knife-wielding peasants, gray-robed wizards, and angry Roman soldiers. In the morning, dawn revealed 80 AD in all its unpleasant glory. Jade sat up and sighed, rubbing gritty eyes with dirty fingers. She felt filthy. Her hair and clothes smelled of smoke. Bryn laughed at her when she washed her face and hands in a bucket of freezing water drawn from the well. Shivering, she tried to pat her long, white blonde hair back into some semblance of order. Eventually, she gave up and tied it back with a strip of leather, wishing for shampoo and a hot shower. After a sketchy breakfast of some sort of thin gruel, they gathered their gear. Bryn cast one last look around his temporary home and shrugged. He carried a leather hunting sling, and his pockets bulged with sling stones and various small, probably stolen artifacts. Otherwise, he took precious few things away with him, leaving most as though they didn't matter. He closed the door and they stepped out into a bright spring dawn. Phoenix blinked in the glare of the morning sun. Holding up a hand to shade his eyes, he leaned over and muttered in Jade's ear. I suppose sunglasses would be too much to ask for. She screwed up her nose and pulled the hood of her cloak up to shade her eyes. Sunglasses, cars, microwaves, McDonald's, showers, laundries, and refrigerators, all too much to ask for. He grinned down at her, and she couldn't help but smile back. This adventure seemed a whole lot less scary in the clear light of day. Phoenix squared his broad shoulders, squinted down the road, and raised his right foot. Well, what was it the gray woman said? A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So here we go. He put his foot down, and Jade did the same, laughing. Bryn shook his head, brushing past them, heading south. Come on. If you want to stay ahead of the Romans, we'd better take more than one step. Oh, he paused, glancing back at Jade before pulling a small leather bag out of a pocket. Casually, he tossed it to her. It clinked. Since you've hired me, I guess you'd better have your money back, so I can get paid. Jade caught it, gaping at the boy in shock. She snatched open her own purse and tipped it out onto the ground. Gravel poured forth, clattering into a small heap. Her mouth dropped open. You, she stammered. You stole all my money. Bryn shrugged, grinning. Last night. I took it from the Roman snitch. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. It seemed like a good idea at the time. He shrugged again. I am a thief, after all. How can we trust you? She snapped her teeth shut, glaring at him. I gave it back, didn't I? He said simply. Let's go. It's a good 50 leagues. Close to a 7 days walk if we're not going to take the roads. We have to get to the forest as fast as we can. Keep a watch for patrols. Without further explanation, he began to jog away. Jade looked at Phoenix, who grimaced and shrugged as well. Like he said, he's a thief. Don't stress, he added, obviously seeing her annoyance. We need him. If this equinox thing is only a few days away, then we don't have time to find anyone else. We'll just keep an eye on him. Let's go. He swung into a ground-eating easy jog, and shortly after, she caught him up, still frowning. Soon they'd left the tiny hamlet behind, and were following a well-used road running alongside an expanse of marshy land that bordered the river. On their right were small fields, cattle, and straggling stands of forest. Twice they jogged past carters carrying goods in the opposite direction, back toward the village they'd left. They ran and walked, alternately, mostly in silence, except for the jingling of Phoenix's sword sheath. Jade's long fair hair escaped the tie and streamed out behind her in a light spring breeze. Birds twittered alarm calls in the forest as they passed, and the sun rose warm in a clear blue sky. Their characters were used to this sort of travel, and they barely had to breathe hard to keep up a steady pace. Finally, they reached the edge of the farmed land and halted, staring at a vast, dark forest rising like a wall before them. The Roman road veered sharply left, skirting the edge of the forest as though it, too, was frightened of the place. Traces of an older, less well-marked path ran straight ahead. Bryn pointed. "We go in here, and if we're lucky, we'll make it through without encountering the forest folk." "I thought they would be friendly to non-Romans," Jade said, brushing her fingers over the pointed tips of her own half-elven ears. "Years ago, yes," Bryn shrugged, "but the folk here have been long besieged by the Romans and no longer trust anyone." He glanced at Jade. "I'm not sure they would even welcome you, my lady, not being a full-blood elf and all." Jade looked at him, startled. Phoenix frowned at her. It hadn't occurred to either of them that her half-bloodedness might cause a problem with elvenkind, as well as the Romans. Bryn set off, and the two players shouldered their packs once more, following him off the road and into the gloom of the forest. Under the canopy, Phoenix paused for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of the forest, letting his eyes adjust to the dappled light falling on the leaf-strewn floor. As they moved on, he soon realized that part of him was always watching and listening. His warrior self was always alert. His brain seemed to automatically know what woodland sounds it could safely ignore and what might pose a threat. His eyes flicked to follow small movements, and his hand never strayed far from the hilt of his sword. His feet involuntarily picked out the smoothest path and made little noise. It was quite incredible to feel so at home in the forest when he'd never spent any time here in the real world. Phoenix grinned to himself, feeling the flow of energy and the flex of muscle in his body. He could quite easily get used to this. This was definitely more fun than just watching on the computer screen. They ran and walked through the forest for an hour, heading steadily west and slightly south, paralleling the Roman road. With casual skill, Bryn brought down some small game with his sling in preparation for dinner later. Twice they stopped and hid to avoid being seen by travelers on the nearby road. A third time they lay breathless, while a small contingent of Roman soldiers, their scarlet-plumed helmets bobbing in time, marched toward the capital. Back on the forest path, Phoenix noticed a growing discomfort and finally decided he couldn't wait any longer. He stepped off the track and stopped, dropping his pack on the ground. "What's up?" Jade asked. "I have to go," he muttered. Bryn nodded, understanding immediately. Jade glanced around, looking perplexed. "Go where?" Phoenix looked at her steadily for a moment, then jerked his head toward a cluster of large shrubs a little way inside the forest. "I have to go," he said significantly. Jade stared at him for a moment. Then her eyes lit with understanding, and she giggled. Bryn grinned too. "I get it. Well, I have to admit," she looked around, "going to the toilet isn't usually mentioned in the books I've read. You better grab some leaves." She smiled, adding in a whispered aside, "They don't invent toilet paper for a couple of 1,000 years." Phoenix flushed with embarrassment and ripped 3 of the largest leaves he could find off a low plant that grew amongst grass and pretty spring flowers beside the track. They were a bit too crinkly to be really useful, but they were the best he could see. "I wouldn't use that if I were you," Jade warned. Bryn's smile widened. "Ah, milady, you're a better person than I wouldn't have told him." "We can't afford him to be ill," she pointed out. Phoenix looked at the leaves in his hand. They looked okay. "Why can't I use these?" "It's ragwort," she replied. "It's toxic. You can absorb the poison through your skin, and it can lead to severe problems breathing. She indicated another plant not far away. Try that one. It's harmless. Nice big leaves, too. Phoenix glanced at her, and back at the leaves in his hand, wondering whether she was just pulling his leg. He decided not to risk it. She might be a bit of a worrywart, but she seemed to be confident enough about this. He tossed the leaves away and murmured a self-conscious thanks, ignoring Bryn's laughing comment that he should just wash his backside in a stream, like everyone else. He grabbed the other leaves and walked purposefully off into the forest, trying to look cool about what he was doing. He wasn't. He'd never considered that toilets, as he knew them, didn't exist in this time. It would be at least 1800 years before the first indoor flush toilet was invented. Right now, a hole in the ground was the best anyone could expect. Being out in the forest meant he couldn't even have that. Resignedly, Phoenix ducked behind the bushes and hoped they were thick enough to screen him from Jade's eyes. Minutes later, feeling much better, he emerged from the bushes, found the forest path again, and glanced around for the others. The path was empty. His companions had vanished. Chapter 8. Phoenix's first instinct was to yell out their names. He even opened his mouth, but then his warrior awareness kicked in and he shut it with a snap. A rapid scan of the dirt path showed no extra footprints and no signs of a struggle. His backpack was gone too. So they were either hiding for some strange reason, or they'd gone ahead without him, which seemed unlikely. A flash of scarlet off toward the road caught his eye. Romans. A stone from Bryn's sling whistled past his ear. Jade hissed at him from several meters away. Silently, he glided over to join them where they hid behind a large thicket. Romans, Bryn warned softly, pointing toward the road. Phoenix nodded. This group of soldiers was moving slower than the others. There were more of them, too, and they weren't sticking to the road.